By mid-1941, Germany was in a precarious position. Their military had conquered most of continental Europe, but their economy was beginning to creak. Britain's Royal Navy was blockading their newly won territory, and supplies were running short. In fact, the only thing keeping Germany in the war was Soviet supplies of food, oil and raw materials delivered to Germany as part of the Nazi-Soviet pact. But this was a situation that Hitler could not stand. He had always hated Stalin and the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik peoples of the East. He refused to be dependent on them. Instead, he planned to take their resources for himself.
For Hitler, there was no time to waste. Britain was still in the war and being supplied with immense quantities of war material by both its global empire and the United States. They were sure to outproduce Germany in the long run, and so the resources of the Soviet Union became Hitler's only lifeline. But the Soviet Union was a huge country with massive manpower, and while Hitler fought them, he would have to go without the resources they had been providing. With time clearly on the Allies' side, Germany had to defeat the Soviets quickly, or Hitler would face losing the war.
The result was the largest invasion in military history, a savage war of annihilation played out across an 1,800-mile front. The invasion would ultimately cost the lives of tens of millions of people and decide the outcome of the Second World War. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler and his generals were confident of victory. After all, Germany had defeated Russia during the First World War while France stood strong. Now, with France having been destroyed in a matter of weeks, the Soviet Union seemed sure to crumble under German military might. This confidence was combined with the Nazis' hatred of the Soviet Union. They believed that the Slavic people of the East were racially inferior. As Hitler put it, you only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down.
In 1941, the Soviet Red Army was in complete disarray. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin's reign of terror had resulted in a number of purges aimed at eliminating perceived enemies of the state. It is estimated that out of 75,000 to 80,000 officers and high-ranking officials across the armed forces, some 30,000 were either imprisoned or executed. Another 10,000 officers were dismissed in disgrace. They were often replaced by young, inexperienced men who had been thrust into positions far beyond their capabilities. On top of that, the Red Army was also in the middle of a restructure, following several lackluster campaigns. The Spanish Civil War, the Russo-Finnish War, and the Soviet occupation of Poland had highlighted several weaknesses, but this restructure was a huge undertaking and was only partially complete by the summer of 1941. As a result, the Red Army were underprepared, poorly led, and inadequately supplied. This was the perfect moment for the Germans to invade.
The Germans and their allies assembled a force of 3.9 million men in 3 army groups. Hitler had wanted to focus his main effort in the south, where the Soviet resources were most plentiful, but his generals insisted on prioritising the centre, wanting to repeat the successes of their campaigns in 1940. The Soviets, meanwhile, had 4.9 million men, but only 2.7 million were at the frontier, with the strongest units in the south. The German plan was to encircle and destroy these border armies in front of the Dvina-Dnieper line. After that, they expected Soviet resistance to essentially collapse. They could then advance to the so-called AA line, deep in the Soviet interior, and administer the lands for themselves. It would be the realisation of Hitler's lifelong dream.
From the very beginning, Operation Barbarossa was conceived as a war of annihilation. Since the 1920s, core Nazi policies included the destruction of the Soviet Union by military force, the permanent elimination of the so-called Judeo-Bolshevik threat to Germany, and the seizure of Lebensraum, or living space, for German exploitation. This new land would be ruthlessly exploited at the cost of local populations. This German planning map in our Second World War galleries lays bare Germany's intentions. The areas in yellow are regions that produce surplus food. This would be taken for Germany. The brown-tinted areas normally imported their food from other regions. Here, the Soviet people would be left to starve. This is just one example of the Nazis' ruthless plans for the Soviet Union. It was mass murder on an unimaginable scale.
Operation Barbarossa began on the 22nd of June 1941. The Soviets were taken completely by surprise. Stalin had received numerous warnings of invasion from captured German soldiers in the border districts and from the British and American governments, but he did not trust them and was wary of provoking a German invasion. Soviet freight trains full of raw materials continued to cross the border into Germany only hours before the attack. The German Luftwaffe won air supremacy almost immediately, destroying over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first morning of the war. This allowed the German army to unleash its manoeuvre warfare, a tactic we know today as Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, is a combined arms strategy designed to achieve victory in a short period of time, rather than a prolonged battle. It did this using fast, overwhelming force in a concentrated area. At the spearhead were the panzer groups. They included units like the 13th Panzer Division, whose uniform you can see here. They would break through the weak points in enemy defences, encircling them and causing chaos and confusion. After that, infantry divisions wearing uniforms like this one would follow up and destroy these pockets. These non-motorised, slow-moving troops made up the vast majority of the German forces. Blitzkrieg helped the Germans achieve great success in the early part of the Second World War and continued to do so during the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. It seemed that Hitler was on course for the quick victory that he so desperately needed.
The panzer groups drove deep into Soviet territory, particularly in the north and the centre. At Minsk, they encircled 3 Soviet armies in a huge pocket, killing and capturing 417,000 Red Army soldiers. The Soviets did cause some delays, particularly in the south, where they launched a strong counterattack. Their new KV-1 and T-34 tanks were impervious to most German anti-tank guns and caused major delays. But the attacks were disorganised, and by the end of the first week, virtually all the Soviet mechanised corps had lost 90% of their strength. As July began, the Germans stood on the banks of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. The Soviet Western Front had effectively ceased to exist, and the others had been severely mauled. To the Germans, it must have seemed that a quick victory was within reach, but little did they know, the Soviets were regrouping.
The Soviet Union was able to mobilise a seemingly endless amount of soldiers. This was due to practices they had implemented in the 1920s and 30s. The idea was that formations would have very few active soldiers during peacetime, but in wartime, these formations would swell in size to become full combat formations. In 1938, they introduced the Universal Military Service Law, which extended the reservist age to 50. They also created a network of schools to train them. This meant that by the time Germany invaded, the Soviets had a pool of approximately 14 million men who had at least basic military training, a figure that Germany had vastly underestimated. Soviet industry also displayed remarkable resilience. Within days of the German invasion, Stalin had made efforts to relocate much of the Soviet Union's heavy industry from the western parts of the country to the Urals and Siberia. These posters in our Second World War gallery pay tribute to the efforts of the Soviet factory workers and the miners, with the words "Salute the heroes."
The Germans expected the Soviets to field around 300 divisions during the campaign. Instead, by the end of the year, the Soviets would field over 800 divisions, with 57 new field armies mobilised. Their mere existence was a terrible surprise to the Germans. The attack renewed on the 10th of July. The German panzer groups struck out north and south at the city of Smolensk, threatening to close their teeth around yet another pocket and capturing a bridgehead over the Desna River at Yelnya. However, here they were stopped by the surprise appearance of Red Army reinforcements. The Soviets then counterattacked, aiming to break the German encirclement. The pressure was immense, and the casualties on both sides were extremely heavy. but the Germans held out thanks to poor coordination amongst the inexperienced Soviet forces. Germany had won the battle for Smolensk, but it was something of a Pyrrhic victory.
They did achieve their objective, encircling and decimating the 16th, 19th and 20th armies. It is estimated that some 350,000 Soviet soldiers were captured or killed in the encirclement. However, this victory came at a great cost. The German panzer groups in particular were severely depleted at Smolensk. They were much further ahead than their supporting infantry, leaving them exposed to attack by the Red Army. By the middle of August, the two panzer groups of Army Group Centre were at 50% strength. The Soviet field armies were supposed to have been wiped out. Instead, the Battle of Smolensk was a clear sign that the Soviets were still in the fight.
By the end of July, it was clear that Operation Barbarossa was not going to plan. The German strategy had to change. Hitler decided that the panzer groups of Army Group Centre should be rerouted north and south to destroy the Soviet forces in their rear. This would secure the flanks of Army Group Centre and capture the vital resources of Ukraine. The attack began in mid-August, but now new problems reared their ugly heads.
One of the main challenges faced by the Germans was logistics. The Soviet Union only had 40,000 miles of road, and much of it was in terrible condition. This meant that the German trucks and tanks were constantly breaking down. Even worse, whilst there were 51,000 miles of railway that the Germans had hoped to utilise, the Soviets used a wider gauge track, making the German trains unusable. The further the Germans moved into Soviet territory, the harder it became to resupply their troops. The Soviets also used scorched earth tactics. Buildings were demolished, bridges were destroyed, dams were sabotaged, and the crops were burnt. This loss of infrastructure and resources was a further blow to the Germans, who were hoping to utilise them for their own war efforts. Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine relied on speed. Now their advance was starting to slow.
Intense fighting continued throughout August and September. In the north, the Germans joined with Finnish forces to surround the city of Leningrad. However, attempts to storm the city failed thanks to tenacious Soviet resistance and a mass of trenches and fortifications dug by Soviet civilians. In the aftermath, Hitler decided to starve the city into submission, beginning a brutal siege that would last for another 2 years. In the centre, the Soviets continued to hammer the German forces east of Smolensk, eventually forcing them to abandon their bridgehead at Yelnya. And finally, in the south, the German panzer groups broke through again, threatening to encircle the entire Soviet southwestern front. However, by the time Stalin gave permission for his troops to retreat, it was too late. The result was the largest encirclement in military history, with 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured. By the end of September, the Germans had taken massive amounts of Soviet territory. Now, the civilians who lived there were being subjected to the brutality of Nazi rule.
The Einsatzgruppen were special German paramilitary units, sometimes described as mobile killing squads. It was their job to secure newly acquired territory. The units were also tasked with identifying and neutralising potential enemies of German rule. In reality, this meant the massacre of millions of civilians deemed as an existential threat to Germany. Their main targets became Jews, but Roma, non-Jewish communists, and people with disabilities were also murdered. Jewish residents were generally rounded up and moved to a predetermined location on the outskirts of a town, village, or city. They were then taken to a pre-prepared mass grave, or they were forced to dig one themselves before being shot dead by German forces or local collaborators. This is sometimes referred to as the Holocaust by bullets. 7-year-old Edik Tonkinoje was living with his maternal grandparents in Satanov, Ukraine, when the Germans invaded. His parents were working with a touring theatre company, but they kept in touch via letter. Edik's father was subsequently drafted into the Red Army, and his mother was evacuated to Tashkent. She wouldn't find out the fate of her son until 1944, when the town was liberated. In 1942, Edic and his grandparents were rounded up by Einsatzgruppen C and killed. They were just 3 of the up to 2 million Jewish people murdered by mass shooting during the Holocaust.
On the 30th of September, the Germans began their final attack towards Moscow. Army Group Center had a massive force of nearly 2 million men and 1,500 tanks. Meanwhile, the Soviets facing them were depleted from their counterattacks against Smolensk and had just 1.2 million men dug into hastily prepared positions. For Hitler, this operation, codenamed Typhoon, was his final chance to end the war before winter. It began well. The German panzer groups cut through with ease, and 2 more encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk yielded another 600,000 prisoners. Stalin soon ordered the evacuation of government offices in Moscow, sparking panic amongst the civilian population. However, the Red Army continued to offer tenacious resistance, while the German forces were becoming more and more exhausted.
The continued use of Blitzkrieg tactics had taken their toll on the German forces. Only 1/3 of all motor vehicles were still operational, and infantry divisions were operating at approximately half their strength. On top of that, autumn rains turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, and horse-drawn and wheeled transport became helplessly stuck. The Germans had no choice but to temporarily halt their operations. By mid-November, the temperature had dropped and the ground was now frozen enough to resume their advance. Clothing, like this greatcoat, lined with animal fur, was hurriedly produced for the German soldiers, whilst felt or straw overboots like these were also issued to protect the soldiers' feet. However, German rail transport had to prioritise fuel and ammunition to continue the fighting, and much of the desperately needed winter clothing never reached the front line. In some German units, there were more losses from frostbite and sickness than from combat.
By November, the Soviets had received yet more reinforcements and had had enough time to dig strong defensive fortifications. The Germans, on the other hand, were a spent force, their supplies of fuel exhausted. The German commanders wanted to stop and fortify their positions, but Hitler insisted they continue pushing. By the 5th of December, they were within sight of Moscow, with 2 pincers reaching out to encircle the city. But the Germans were overstretched, and the Soviets took advantage. What started with local counterattacks around Moscow became a counter-offensive across the entire front. Only skilled defensive fighting allowed the Germans to cling on. By the time the offensive came to an end in April, the threat to Moscow was gone, and Operation Barbarossa was over. Hitler's great gamble had failed. Germany now found itself locked into a battle of attrition against the Soviet Union, Britain, and most recently the United States, all without the vital resources it needed. It was a strategic disaster and a human tragedy. The Germans had 1 million men killed and wounded, nearly 7 times what they lost in the Battle of France. The Soviets, on the other hand, lost over 6 million men, killed, taken prisoner, wounded and sick. These figures do not even include civilian losses, which also numbered in the millions.
Operation Barbarossa was a major turning point in the Second World War, if not the turning point. The Germans had to defeat the Soviets within a matter of weeks, but they totally underestimated their enemy, the terrain and Stalin himself, whilst completely overestimating their own abilities. As a result, the Germans started a war that they couldn't finish. But what truly stopped the Nazi onslaught was the resilience of the Soviet regime and its people. It was their sacrifice that turned the German Blitzkrieg into a battle of attrition. The costs were shockingly high. However, the war on the Eastern Front had only just begun. It would take another 3 years to expel the Germans from the Soviet Union.